Hello everybody, how's it going? I'm SMAM, and today we're going to try a type of video which I haven't attempted so far on this channel. This one's been a long time in the making, spent a bit of time in the works as I've been writing about the things that I'll be covering today, poring over them, making this ranking, seeing how it's all going to come together. And the type of video we're going to be doing is just that, it's a worst to best ranking, but not of any band. We're doing a worst to best ranking of Radiohead, which is gonna kill me. Radiohead are, well, they're my favourite band of all time. Like, I don't think that's even in contention for me at this point. And, you know, I've cycled through so many different musical tastes, periods of loving one genre and not really loving another, discovered all these new artists, gone through tastes and obsessions. But throughout it all, there's been one band since I was really young, like 11 or 12, that has underpinned the whole thing for me and been a constant favourite throughout pretty much my entire teenage life and into adulthood, and that's been Radiohead. English band, 5-piece led by Tom York, Johnny Greenwood on guitars, Ed O'Brien on more guitars, Colin Greenwood on bass, and the legendary Phil Selway on drums. Has released some of the most groundbreaking, innovative, even downright experimental music of the past couple decades. Starting from their humble origins, obviously, as a grunge-influenced alt-rock band in the 90s, they've continued to success after success, and pretty much now are one of the world's biggest rock bands, and certainly probably the most acclaimed rock band since, like the Beatles. They're really that important and that influential to the history of modern music, and they've been that important and that influential to my life personally as well. They've been there for me throughout years and years, and as time's gone on, my tastes for them have developed, my favourite albums and tracks have developed. I decided that for this channel I was going to sit down and once and for all definitively rank every Radiohead album from worst to best, and make no mistake, that was a behemoth of a task, because ranking Radiohead's albums worst to best for me at this point is like trying to rank my limbs from worst to best, because they're honestly that much of a part of me and so integral to my life and my music taste at this point that it's honestly hard to pull them apart and like dissect them on a minute level. Like it can be easy to do with some other bands. But I did it. I have a ranking of all 9 Radiohead albums, starting from the worst to the absolute cream of the crop. I will be going through them one by one, explaining my choices, explaining my opinions on the albums, and I expect some criticism. I expect some people to disagree with me. There's some things that I really agree with other Radiohead fans, and there are some areas where I'll probably be in disagreement. So if you have any opinions on my opinions, let me know in the comments. I'd be interested to have a discussion. I will talk about Radiohead till the cows come home. So without further ado, let's get into it. And let's get into the album at number 9 in the rankings, which I think you will probably expect. Like, I don't think it was going to be any other album. I mean, come on, it's Pablo Honey. Number 9, worst Radiohead album is Pablo Honey. Now, people tend to be a bit unfair on Pablo Honey, in my opinion. I think what happens is that people tend to associate all the imagery from the period around Pablo Honey, you know, 93, 94, Tom's hair, the crazy anyone can play guitar beach house performance, the ridiculous, you know, 90s shirts and fashion. Even the band appearing on that one hideous fashion shoot back in the day, which I'll try and find a photo of to include in this video. People associate all of that crap so intimately with the album that the music almost becomes secondary to like the idea of the thing. You know, the idea that once upon a time, Radiohead were pretty much little more than just 5 kids, like in their late teens, early 20s, who wanted to be stars. They wanted to be on top of the pops. They wanted to be the biggest band in the UK and, you know, compete with bands that were in their scene at the time, like, you know, the Manic Street Preachers, the Breeders, that sort of era and style of music. And I think people look at that and for some reason they feel like it's a personal affront to them that Radiohead had a start like that. You know, they get all like, how dare they? How dare my precious Radiohead like want to become famous as kids? How dare they not be the band that created OK Computer? You know, that sort of thing. So whenever I listen to this album, I tried my best to separate all that, as hilarious as it is, from the actual music itself. So I'm going to deliver my opinion of this album, Pablo Honey, 93, separate from the band's behemoth of a reputation and a legacy. Alright, here goes. Pablo Honey, this album is not that good. Alright, I feel like I should start with some of the things that I like about this album, and make no mistake, there are several, and I think this album doesn't get enough credit for the things it does really well. First of all, I think in terms of like raw power and speed and energy and performance, the band were pretty much at their best, technically here, right? I mean, this is a fast and energetic and thrashed up album with no real concessions to softer moments outside of one or two spots. And that leads to some of the best performances, I think, on any Radiohead album. I mean, Tom, for instance, I think you can't argue that he isn't delivering his A-game vocally here, right? I mean, look at the end of Creep, which has that scream that has become one of the most iconic Radiohead moments in their entire catalogue, even among superfans. And also look at the end of Prove Yourself with that sustained high note. Absolutely gorgeous moments like that. Absolutely stunning notes and performances. And it's easy to see early on why people were wowed by this band, why they were encouraged to go to live performances, and why they realised that the band had potential that was soon to be obviously developed into something bigger and greater. I also think there's several really great songs here, the best of which show where the band is going, I think, on future albums. So to that degree, I don't think it has enough personality of its own in its best moments, but I still think that doesn't take away from the individual songs. So for example, you have Blowout, the closer, which rides this really loose bossa nova feel with these delicate vocals and an almost Sonic Youth-esque conclusion. It's a great song that really wouldn't be out of place on the bends, or even OK Computer, I'd argue. There's also the opener, which is You. Early show of complexity in time signatures, you know, with that 3 measures of 6/4, then 1 measure of 5/4 thing that it has going on, led by Phil's excellent drumming. It's full of energy and pep and bite, and it's probably the biggest headbanging moment on the album and one of the biggest headbanging moments of their whole career. I also like a handful of the more conventional 90s alt rock songs here, even though they're cheesy as all hell for the most part. I mean, How Do You, for instance, which is the third track, it's fun. I don't care what people say. It's fun with that 3-guitar attack, with Tom's snotty, bratty vocals. I always have a blast listening to that song, even though it's obviously not like a technical masterpiece or anything. And also Thinking About You, which is one of the softer moments on the album. A really plaintive, emotional moment, even if the lyrics kind of suck, and I don't think anyone's going to convince me otherwise. But I like how light the guitar arrangement is with the light marching band-esque drums. I always get sort of a bit teary at that song even, which again is so fucking incongruous to the lyrics, which suck. And that's obviously before even addressing the elephant in the room, which is Creep. Radiohead's biggest song to this day, the song that's pretty much defined them for so many fans worldwide, and also for so many casual listeners that might not have even heard OK Computer or Kid A. And a lot of people hate it. The band doesn't hate it. I think that's a big misconception. If you actually read into it, the band never really hated it, except for maybe like some of the really early years. They just think it's overplayed and they don't want that to be the song that the band is remembered by, but honestly, they could do much worse for a song that the band is remembered by, because I think it's a great song. I think the chorus is fantastic. I think the hooks are absolutely chart-worthy, pure pop goodness. And of course, Johnny's guitar stabs are just instantly iconic. I really like Creep, and I don't get what superfans have against it, to be honest. Now, I'm done praising this album for now. I think that's where about the good things stop. This is a really, really flawed album that's mostly outclassed by its contemporaries around the time. I mean, for every You or, you know, every Blowout, you have a song like the trite emo posturing of Vegetable, or the Pixies' worship of Prove Yourself, or I Can't, which is genuinely one of Radiohead's worst songs. Probably their single worst song, in my opinion. And I feel like just as this album starts to get a momentum going, it gets dragged down by songs that manage to be both overblown and underwritten at the same time, which is just a really bizarre contrast to strike, and not the sort of contrast you'd want a band like this to strike. So I think the album lacks a lot of that consistency that it would otherwise really need to be a great album. Also, the production sucks. Like, the production really sucks. It lacks any sort of body, it's thin and watery. It has none of the sort of full-bodied, meaty punch of the later album, even like The Bends, which is the next album. I think once Nigel Godrich came on board, first as engineer, then as full-blown producer, their sound started to get a bit beefier, and it started to sound a bit more full, which fit the arrangements really well. But for now, on this album, The production is just not it. It is really not it. Ultimately, I think Pablo Honey's greatest weakness is that you can carbon date it, which you can't really do with any other Radiohead album. Like an album like In Rainbows or an album like Amnesiac cannot be particularly placed on any particular time. But this album, you can carbon date it to a very particular and even slightly embarrassing period of 90s rock that was overblown, trite, and self-pitying in a really uniquely unpleasant way. So while I don't think this album is awful, and I think it does actually beat some of its contemporaries, it gets beaten by a lot of its other contemporaries. And for that reason, I consider it easily Radiohead's worst album, even though it's not really a train wreck at the end of the day, I wouldn't say. Alright, so that's number 9, Pablo Honey, and now that we're done with that, we get into the core of Radiohead's catalogue, which is an area that I like to love to adore pretty much every single album here. And I think that's perfectly evidenced by the number 8 pick. These bottom 3, just above Pablo Honey anyway, were extremely hard to rank for me. Honestly, you could put any 3 of them in any particular order, filling out these spots. But in the end, I sort of went with my gut for this, and I decided to put number 8 as Radiohead's 2011 album, The King of Limbs. I mean, even last year, The King of Limbs was probably higher than this on a theoretical ranking of mine, and over the years I have watched my opinions dramatically evolve and change. But that also doesn't mean that number 8 is bad, by Radiohead standards especially. I mean, I like this album a lot. It's Radiohead's most concise album, Radiohead's shortest album, and also one of its most enveloping. I think it has a very distinct atmosphere and feel with its nature themes, its green-tinged artwork. It really feels like getting lost in the woods somewhere, in some forgotten part of the world. And I absolutely love that atmosphere. I think the songs propel it forward really well. And I respect it for the fact that no other Radiohead album has such a natural, organic feel like this one does. And that's backed up by the weird songs on this album. Like, make no mistake, this is probably Radiohead's weirdest album, and every song sounds completely disparate and different from the last. It opens with the submarine beauty of Bloom, which is anchored around this indistinct 6/4 drum loop and these shimmering, cascading pianos over which Tom's voice just soars. Tom's vocal performance on this, for this late in his career, is gorgeous, and I mean, the bass as well, that liquid, languid bass that just pours over every inch of the production, my god. It's absolutely incredible. Honestly, one of their best opening tracks, and that's saying something in such a crowded field. Lotus Flower, I think, is another really easy highlight on this album. You know, you get more gorgeous liquid bass work and that ultra simple drum pattern, which might be sequenced, I still can't work it out, with that sultry tom melody sort of dancing with the groove and doing a tango around that gorgeous bass line and the sultriness of it all. It's one of Radiohead's most seductive and moody songs, and it's suitable for like a late night walk around some forgotten city or being chased by the cops through the woods. But on the complete other side of the album, you have like a codex, which sounds like the post-chase ride in the police car to the site of your execution. You know, that's always been, I think, my personal favourite song on the album. It is devastatingly beautiful, devastatingly gorgeous, and it's one of Tom's best piano ballads. You know, with its enveloped production hidden piano chords that just plod along through the track in the most absolutely gorgeous way. And the light horn accompaniments in the background that adds some nice harmonic counterpoint rather to the incredible piano work and Tom's gorgeous, delicate vocals. It's just a fantastic track from start to finish. Now, the reason why this album's ranked this low is because I feel that sometimes the songwriting honestly gets a bit too oblique for its own good. Little by Little, I think, is the best example of that, and that's the one I always go to. You know, it's this rickety, percussion-heavy, and slightly clunky sounding song that sometimes feels like it's gonna collapse under the weight of its own arrangement. With its sort of crazy time signature stuff going on, the worlds and worlds of percussion, including the electronic stuff, and Tom's slightly dissonant vocals. I mean, the chorus is good, but I think the verses sound a bit slapdash, and for that reason, I've never really liked Little by Little. Although I do like Feral. Fuck Feral haters. I also feel that while the album is reasonably strong, it's not exactly the most engaging or re-listenable record, and it's probably the easiest to sort of tune out and listen to as background music. The last 2 tracks in particular, I think, often lose my attention a bit. I mean, they're really pretty, like particularly the all-acoustic loop-based nature of Give Up the Ghost, which is quite a pretty song. But they also come after Codex, which is just devastatingly gorgeous and also very slow in the mold of these last two tracks. And I think those last three tracks coming after one another, they do kind of end the album on an anticlimactic note, I think. Ultimately, I hate that I've sort of conceded to this album's detractors a little bit. I used to be a total bastion of the King of Limbs love. I really did, but, you know, as time has gone on, I've sort of found that it's an album I've grown to like a lot, but not really love. And ultimately, I think that's this album's fate, which is unfortunate. So that's why The King of Limbs comes in at number 8, and my least favourite album of the core Radiohead material that we consider to be, you know, their strongest work today. Now, number 7, again, this was another placement that's been really difficult for me to put, but I decided to put in the 7th place on this ranking Amnesiac, Radiohead's 2001 album. This is another one that has sort of sunk down a spot over time along with The King of Limbs, but not really because of anything that it's done wrong in particular, just because the album at number 6 has like shot up in my rankings as of late. You know, plenty of comparisons have been made comparing this to Kid A, which is the album whose recording sessions Amnesiac was assembled from. But I'm going to say them again. You know, Amnesiac is Kid A's fucked up twin brother, in my opinion. It's an album that feels like it's been locked up in a dark room for years and has emerged as some malformed, malevolent beast. As a result, it's their darkest album, I think, and also probably the least fun to listen to, if that means anything. I mean, when the closest you have to like a happy song on this album is Pyramid Song, which, by the way, is probably the most universally beloved Radiohead song ever, and a song that I've come to realise deserves pretty much all the hype it gets. You know your LP isn't really an optimistic one. I think for that reason, it's become one of my least replayed albums of theirs, because I have to be in a very specific mood to enjoy a song like the mangled ambient of Like Spinning Plates, or the claustrophobic horn-based vitriol of Life in a Glass House, which, for as great as it gets, ends up being one of their lesser closers, in my opinion. But god damn does this album have some strong songs, and I'd actually say that for the most part, this album manages to be stronger on a song-by-song basis than as a whole. The opener is probably my single favourite Radiohead opener, a dark, anemic electronic nightmare world of a song that rides along on one of Radiohead's single best bass lines of all time, even if it's purely electronic with this gorgeous subby synth, and features incredible muted vocals from Tom. You know, for a while there, it was actually probably up there with my top 3 Radiohead songs. It's genuinely that good, and it remains one of my favourite songs of theirs to this day. Come to think of it, the bass is actually like pretty universally great on this album, I think. I mean, Dollars and Cents is a prime example for me. It rides along on this fantastic repeated ascending minor key bass line. And the fact that it always keeps you on a knife's edge with the way it, you know, always sounds like it's about to explode at any moment just before pulling itself back is just incredible. Really creative songwriting, I think, from the band. I might be wrong too. I love how the guitars and bass snake around one another to make one of the most iconic riffs in Radiohead history. Although I do think the coda is a bit unnecessary, but other than that, I love how that fiery hot, red hot guitar work is contrasted beautifully with that icy cold percussion and Tom's treated mechanical vocals. I think that track is an absolute masterclass. I even like the mechanical grind of, you know, a pull revolving doors, which explodes out of Pyramid Song like a bat out of hell and totally minces Tom's vocals out and spits them out on the other end until they're like a mangled mess of spoken word. It's a really creative, entertaining track that I think only Radiohead could pull off in the way that they did. If it isn't clear, I like this album a lot, and perhaps if it was a bit shorter, or maybe if it had some of the B-sides from this era in place of tracks like Knives Out and Morning Bell Amnesiac, it would probably be a lot higher, honestly. So, in the end, that's my opinion on Amnesiac. It's a really interesting album, a really fascinating album, an album that I like a lot. Could have been even better. So now we're coming up at number 6, and here we're coming into an album that has grown on me so much over the past, pretty much actually only the past year or two. It's not even funny how much this has grown on me. People have loved this album in the past. I never historically saw it, but recently I'm just seeing sort of how strong this album is, pretty much front to back. And that album, which comes in at number 6, is Radiohead's 1995 second album, The Bends. And, you know, if you had told me a few years ago that I would have considered The Bends to be a better album than Amnesiac or The King of Limbs, I would have committed you to a mental asylum. For the longest time, I did consider it squarely at number 8. I thought it was a decent but sort of highly immature album with only a select few highlights that you had to surgically extract from the rest of the sort of maudlin other songs. Oh boy, was I wrong on that token, let me tell you. What happened to rise this up the ranks for me was my running of a site called the Radiohead Almanac. It's this website that I pretty much created on the Wikia format to document eventually every single live recording of Radiohead's history. I mean, check it out. Links in the description if you want to have a look. So far, I've done up to 95, and I've only done up to 95 because, I mean, there are so many Radiohead live recordings, especially from the early days. So I've been working through live recordings for years at this point, starting from the beginning. And then when I got up to 94, 95, which is the year of the release of the Bends, and 94 when they played a lot of the Ben songs from the first time, I was forced to listen to the live versions of Ben songs over and over and over and have them totally committed to my brain, which is something I'd never really bothered to do before. And shit, I originally thought, this is going to be such a slog. But then I listened, and I listened, and I listened, and I listened, and something magical happened. While the Pablo Honey songs in these performances for the most part remained bland and featureless, some of the songs on the Bends that I'd never really given a chance to before slowly but surely grew on me in the weirdest way, and it took a long time, but there was a watershed moment I distinctly remember where I was like, holy shit, this is a really, really good album. I think the Bends now is full of some of Radiohead's most ingenious songwriting and performances, and it's only very recently that I think I've seen the full extent of the genius that this album has. I mean, take Sulk as an example, which is just a song that I never really gave the time of day before my jaunt through Radiohead's live stuff. I thought it was sort of like the Pablo Honey songs, a bit bland and featureless and underwritten. But then, once I heard some of the early live performances of it, they just blew it open for me. Blew it completely wide open, and now it's one of my total favourite Radiohead songs, I think, with that incredible 4-note guitar line that soars over that shuffling, almost percussive drum work. Same with Bulletproof. I think that was only after maybe the 20th listen of that song in live performance, and I realised just how insanely gorgeous it is in all of its delicacy. Even Fake Plastic Trees, which is by all accounts a straight up classic and one of their most famous songs, and one of the songs that generally I think clicks with people pretty fast, really only warmed to me very recently. I think I never understood just how much of a beating, pained heart there was at the core of that song. I'd say it's really only Black Star and Nice Dream that I've failed to really get into at this point, but I'm sure that'll happen someday too. So when you add that to the songs that I've loved for years, you have a recipe for an album that's grown on me like you would not believe. I've always loved Planet Telex and Just since pretty much the second I heard them. They're two strange inverted takes on rock music that just baffle me on every listen with how visceral they are. And then there's High and Dry, which is one of the most derided Radiohead songs ever, but also somehow a long-standing favourite of mine. I associate that particular song with a very specific time in my life that I might go into in a future video, and even now those sort of wistful acoustic guitar chords and Tom's defeated vocal melody just floor me on every listen. That's one of the tracks that I'll always consider extremely close to my heart, and learning that that track was essentially a demo that was just plunked on the album and into lead single status, pretty incredible. It just is a testament to show how amazing this band is. I mean, it's true that this album's pretty stylistically samey, which is part of the reason I was probably held back from fully appreciating it in the first place. But what we have are these 12 alt-rock tracks with hints of, the influences like Jeff Buckley and R.E.M. that feature some of Radiohead's most earnest, pretension-free and endearing songwriting. Production's lovely, the mixing is lovely, the mastering's lovely. It's all just lovely. Alright, so we're past number 6, we're moving on to number 5. And I think from this point onwards, I love every album that's coming. I mean, previously, I've come close to loving the albums before number 5, but from number 5 onwards, I think you could make a claim for any of these being your favourite Radiohead album, and I would completely understand you and see where you're coming from. And I think I love all of these albums with pretty much every fibre of my being. So, at number 5, the worst of the albums that I love, quote unquote, it's OK Computer. Now, I'm not sure how controversial that ranking will be. I mean, it seems pretty conventional now to not have OK Computer in the number 1 spot. A lot of other albums have had more historic reappraisals more recently. but I think most, at least, would have it in their top 3. So when I put this album, Radiohead's landmark 1997 album, OK Computer, at a measly number 5, I'm not saying it's bad, or I'm not even saying that it's even just good. I think this album is simply fantastic. It's a monolith of an album full of this almost otherworldly but tangible importance to it that I think is completely separate from the critical acclaim it's received. You know, each track feels like it's essential and adds to this sort of overarching narrative of the breakdown of modern society and the damaging influence that technology has on our lives, which I think is even more prescient and cogent today than it was at this point 24 years ago. I also think OK Computer is the sound of a band that finally has full confidence in their direction and in their sound. And I think that reflects in how popular it is. You know, I think everyone, when this album was released, could detect that something fundamentally different was happening here than was happening on Pablo Honey or the Bends. I think they understood that this band finally had confidence that what they were making was strong, which is ironic considering how neurotic and borderline depressed Tom was around this period. I mean, come on, this band was like playing Pop Is Dead in their concerts just 2 years prior. You know, it's amazing how far they came between albums. And it's sort of difficult to talk about this album in a novel way because I guarantee almost anything that I could say has already been said by like Rolling Stone and Mojo and millions of other music critics across the world. You know, I think you learn as someone that loves music and writes and talks about it a lot. It's often more difficult to pile on praise to something that's already been given the acclaim it deserves. For the most part, I love pretty much every song that everyone loves here. I mean, I love the Bohemian Rhapsody-esque multi-part epic that is Paranoid Android. I love the almost pop-adjacent acoustic guitar anthem of Karma Police. And I even love the opener, like more than a lot of other Radiohead openers, Airbag, with that incredible guitar work underpinning the whole thing and the DJ Shadow-esque cut-up drums in the second half. I think all of those tracks are absolutely fantastic. And exit music, my god, exit music. So with that being said, I would like to champion 2 songs in particular, and they're my 2 favourites on the album. They're also 2 tracks that I think almost get the least love on this album and really don't get the attention they deserve. So the first one is Electioneering. Electioneering is a banger. It is a fucking banger. It's a total balls to the wall, coked up, white knuckle hard rock track, almost bordering on like hints of punk and metal at points. The central guitar riff that drives the whole thing is absolutely spot on, and you know, as is Tom's incredible snarl with which he spits out those lyrics about government corruption and the unfair nature of banks and the world that we live in today. I think when it falls apart around 2/3 of the way in and turns into just a total maelstrom of noise, I think it is a perfect reminder that this is like one of Radiohead's heaviest, most flailing and freewheeling songs that they've pretty much ever done. And then there's Climbing Up the Walls, which is, I think, still my second favourite Radiohead track of all time. Yeah, I think it'd be my second favourite. That song is just sheer terror encapsulated in musical form. That warped, discordant bass line played on whatever synthesizer, I think an EMS or something, that continues throughout pretty much the whole thing. Tom's mangled, distorted vocals, and then that incredible heavy end breakdown section with the synth solo, and Tom just giving up and just screaming into his acoustic guitar pickups. I mean, like no other band would come up with something that creative, I don't think. No other band would come up with something as potent or powerfully effective as Radiohead did with Climbing Up the Walls in that particular way. It's honestly one of the best songs ever written, and I fully stand by that. So why is the album not higher on the list? To answer your question, I would honestly have a hard time telling you. I mean, I guess I'm not the biggest fan of No Surprises, and also particularly The Truest. I think it's sort of an anticlimactic ending to the album. And I certainly don't think it's like the most dangerous or edgy Radiohead album, and it's probably not one of the most exciting ones for that reason. But otherwise, OK Computer is just a mind-bogglingly strong album, and it's testament to the albums above it that they somehow managed to edge it out on this ranking. So officially, in the second half of the list, these top 4 are just indescribably amazing albums. And we're going to go into number 4 with Radiohead's most recent work. It's their 2016 album, A Moon-Shaped Pool. Now, A Moon-Shaped Pool is actually a really interesting part of the band's history, and it comes in a really interesting era of their story, because at this point in their career, Radiohead really had nothing to prove. You know, they'd already written what Rolling Stone claimed to be the best album of all time in OK Computer. They'd changed rock music like pretty much entirely in Kid A. They'd done all these incredible albums, and at this point, they didn't really have to prove anything to the critics. They were in the institution. They were, you know, already lauded as one of the best rock bands of all time. So when you're a band like Radiohead, what do you do at that stage in your career? Well, I think in A Moon-Shaped Pool's case, they actually did what you wouldn't expect them to do, and they actually played it really safe. I agree with the description of A Moon-Shaped Pool as the most Radioheady of the Radiohead albums. You know, it's not particularly adventurous, and for the most part, I think it treads ground that the band has already sort of tread in different places on past albums. But holy shit, if this is Radiohead playing it safe, then give me more of that fucking play safe shit. I want them to play it safe on every album they do from here, my god. A Moon-Shaped Pool is just gorgeous front to back. It's the Radiohead album you feel like you should be listening to like in an isolated cabin on a mountainside with a beautiful view of the snow, or in a little cave like the one that Tom finds in the Daydreaming video. It's an isolated bubble of an album that is totally and utterly enveloping, more so than pretty much any other Radiohead album out there. I think Nigel Godrich has some amazing production on this album, and I think it deserves a serious shout out. The whole thing sounds just so lush and dense and carefully layered, and while it doesn't really have a particular punch or bite to it, the production, I think an album like this shouldn't have any rough edges to it. I think all of those should be filed down, to be honest, because I think it's really meant to be soothing and just a total dreamscape of an album. People even have the nerve to call this album overproduced, and I mean, I guess I can sort of see where they're coming from on tracks like Present Tense, which is a track I just could never get into for whatever reason. I mean, I always found that acoustic guitar part at its centre too jarring and poorly written. But I'm sorry, I don't know how you can hold that opinion otherwise. I mean, tracks like The Numbers, which is the folk song that seems to be doing battle with a wave of constant musical detritus, just slowly lapping at the edges of the island that it lies on. And Daydreaming, the utterly gorgeous second track that has quickly emerged as one of Radiohead's most popular and most beloved tracks. You know, both of them work precisely, I think, because they are so densely produced. I think the last 3 tracks as a whole on this album are decent, but the first 8, in my opinion, are where it's at. In particular, that run of tracks from Dex Dark to Desert Island Disc to Full Stop and then finally into Glass Eyes is probably my single favourite run of tracks on any Radiohead album. Like, they're that good. I love every single one of those songs to absolute death. In fact, if I could have one Radiohead track to listen to for pretty much the rest of my life, Desert Island Disc would be a serious contender. It's just fantastic, just mind-blowingly delicate and gorgeous and incredible in how it plays out with that 7/4 rhythm that lulls you into this total sense of security and safety and solitude. It's just, I'm struggling to find words. It's indescribably gorgeous. I feel like I also should talk about Burn the Witch. I owe it one. It was the track that introduced me to the band in 2016 when it first came out, and that whole media frenzy started with the Moon-Shaped Pool rollout. And even today, I think it still holds up totally with the unconventional string arrangements courtesy of Johnny and Nigel, and that really low in the mix drum machine with Tom's vocals just dancing over the top of it. I think it's a soaring and an anthemic track that works incredibly well as the opener for this album. So yeah, honestly, when an album like A Moon-Shaped Pool can manage to be only my 4th favourite album of a band, not my favourite, not my 2nd favourite, my 4th favourite, you can start to see that there's something really special about Radiohead. Okay, baby, we're in the top 3, let's go. This top 3, honestly, 3 of my favourite albums of all time, point blank. They're that important to me, and they're that strong in my mind. It's hard to decide the exact order of this top 3, but in the end, what I came up with is something I'm pretty confident with. And the top 3 starts with the number 3 spot, Radiohead's 2003 double album, their longest album, Hail to the Thief. Hail to the Thief is fucking amazing. And it's by far the most underrated and overlooked Radiohead album in my mind, by far. Not even close. I mean, if there's one goal I have before I die, It's to convince the world that it's damn close to being a 10 out of 10 album, and certainly deserves to be in the upper echelon of Radiohead albums. It's funny this comes straight off a Moon-Shaped Pool in these rankings, right? Because they could not be more different. I mean, a Moon-Shaped Pool is lush and heavily produced. They slaved over it for years. But this is Radiohead's rawest album. There are no concessions to the listener. None of the sharp edges are filed down. This is a brutal, aggressive, acerbic album with some of the band's most distorted production and just some bizarre, aggressive songwriting. I mean, it's for all intents and purposes pretty close to a punk album, and it has a real tangible sense of danger to it, in a way that no other Radiohead album really has. And the punk spirit is channeled clearly on several cuts here. This is a very long track list, but somehow there are pretty much no bad songs. Alright, there's one bad song, but we'll get up to that later. 2 + 2 = 5 opens up the album. It is the most aggressive Radiohead opener since You, all the way back in '93. I always find it so amusing that they follow up, everything in its right place and Packed Like Sardines, which are two mellow, anemic, and electronic openers, with this track, which is just a brutal gut punch of an opener, with walls and walls of murderous guitars and electronics coming out of the speakers and just mauling the listener into submission. I just love how free of polish that track is. I mean, it even opens with freaking studio chatter and guitar feedback, which Radiohead honestly never had the balls to do something that raw on any of their other albums. So really, testament to their nerve and their spirit of experimentation on this album as a whole, that they're willing to open it with a track like that. And honestly, I think it is a great precursor to a lot of the tracks that come later. I think it's just a sublime opener. Also channeling that same punk spirit is We Suck Young Blood, which I love talking about this track. It's this drunken slave ship blues that very briefly just explodes and caterwauls in the middle, before going back to its normal state and returning back to hibernation. And that moment where it just explodes goes down as one of my favourites on any Radiohead song, just because of how left field and balls to the wall it is. Again, they sort of have a bravery and a boldness and sort of a bite to them on this album that they pretty much don't have on any other album in the Radiohead catalogue. If other albums like Moon-Shaped Pool are Radiohead playing it safe, this is Radiohead playing it as dangerous as they possibly can. Even when the album goes electronic, it still maintains that sort of ugly darkness and aggression to it. I mean, take Sit Down Stand Up, which is in my top 3 Radiohead songs to this day, and I'm probably one of very few fans that thinks that. The piano chords that circle around that sort of metronome-like electronic rhythm are absolutely stunning and extremely tense. And then all of that tension is just suddenly released in one big burst as the storm breaks in the second half and the band throws everything in the kitchen sink at the production. I always thought they couldn't really pull off that track live that well. I always thought it sounded a bit sparse if you hear old live recordings of it. They never really could do it live, in my opinion, because especially that second half is such a studio creation. It's a masterpiece beyond description that was totally assembled in the studio, and honestly, it's so much better for it. While we're on the topic of songs that many fans hate but I love, we've got The Gloaming. The Gloaming is the single coldest and most alienating track that the band has ever put out, and I honestly don't think that is even in debate. It's possibly the only track they've ever done, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I think I'm right off the top of my head. It's the only track they've ever done that doesn't even feature a hint of a recognisable instrument over the whole thing. It's all these lightly skittering electronics and tense, highly strung vocals from Tom. To this day, I still can't decide whether I prefer the studio version or the live version. I honestly think they're both stunning. I could go on like this about pretty much every single track from here on out. I mean, I love They're There. I love Where I End and You Begin. I love Go to Sleep. I love, with a passion, Mixomatosis. They're all incredible, and some of them are really frequently overlooked Radiohead classics. Now, because this album takes so many risks and plays with such a tangible sense of danger, it's inevitable that one of those risks eventually falls flat for me. That's Scatterbrain. It's possibly my least favourite Radiohead album track outside of Pablo Honey, and a lot of people love that track. But for once, I just don't see where you guys are coming from. I'm sorry, I think it's this bland, fairly boring milquetoast track with a really clunky and off-putting guitar line and just a melody that makes no real harmonic sense. I think it's always just jarring and creates a bad impression on me at the end of the album. I think without it, it could be pretty close to a 10 out of 10, genuinely. So there's my dose of scatterbrain hate. Tell me in the comments why I'm completely wrong about that. Hail to the Thief. It's raw, it's punishing, totally imperfect, and it's also amazing. Okay, so up to the final two. And in the second place on this countdown, the album that has pretty much defined the band for me for many years, one of the best albums ever made, in my opinion, is Radiohead's 2000 album, Kid A. I sort of find it hard to dissect this album minutely and work out why I feel for it the way I do. I mean, it's sort of bizarre for an album I love this much to sort of leave me so devoid of things to say, and especially cogent, interesting things. I've found over the years sometimes that the albums that have been the most formative for me, the most influential on my tastes and interests and life in general, are often the hardest to talk about because they eventually become more unimpeachable monoliths than they are regular albums. I mean, albums like Dark Side of the Moon or, maybe Mezzanine by Massive Attack, they all fall into that category. And so does Kid A. It's one of those unimpeachable monoliths, an album that is so part of me, it's essentially like a fifth limb. This is the album that got me into the band, pretty much single-handedly. I mean, Burn the Witch might have introduced me to Radiohead, but I distinctly remember being on a school bus in year 9, pulling up Kid A on my phone and listening to it for the very first time. And it was the moment that those first 4 notes of Everything in Its Right Place came through my headphones that I pretty much knew I had found the band that was going to essentially define this chapter of my life, from start to finish. And paradoxically, for that reason, I often find myself listening to Kid A the least nowadays out of Radiohead's albums, even less than maybe Pablo Honey, which is total sacrilege, I know, but it's pretty much inscribed in my DNA at this point, this album, and I fear that listening to it too much will sort of deaden its impact for me. But this album is it's a masterpiece. It's an absolute, utter freaking masterpiece, and each time that I listen to it, it feels like kneeling at the shrine of music. For starters, it has the single most devastating Radiohead track, in my opinion, How to Disappear Completely, with those seasick guitars and Tom's aching vocal melody, eventually clashing at the end with that orchestral bombast with those aching strings and, pummeling horns. I just think it's an absolute utter masterpiece of a song, and it's a potent sort of creature that's really only gotten better and better over time for me. Whenever I'm feeling extremely sad, that still happens to be a track that I turn to the most. And then on the same token, pretty much exactly one track before, this album has the absolute madness, the unhinged, deranged madness of the national anthem, which is this just incredibly weird track where the same orchestral elements that you heard on How to Disappear Completely become tools of war and start to flay you and maul you. The controlled chaos of the national anthem is pretty much unlike anything that Radiohead's ever done, and it's totally possible when you look at a track like that to understand why, at the time of release, this album was met with so much vitriol and so many confused fans. I mean, with a track like that, you can see that this is certainly not another OK Computer. Oh, and I should mention the motion picture soundtrack, the closer of this album, is not only my favourite Radiohead closing track, but it's also the only song of theirs to ever make me cry. True story. For a song that was written around the same time as Creep, freaking Creep, that's just incredible. I mean, I dare you to name a more emotional moment in a Radiohead song than that harp ascending and descending at the end. I dare you. Kid A is it's a 10 out of 10. It is a 10 out of 10 album, and it's a rare album that really truly deserves the title of a masterpiece, and perhaps even the band's defining work. Nothing should be able to beat this album in an ideal world, but we're in the world of Radiohead, and in this weird, upside-down world, something does. So by now you've probably figured it out. My favourite Radiohead album, probably the best Radiohead album, is at number 1. It's Radiohead's 2007 album, In Rainbows. I've always said that my relationship with In Rainbows is fundamentally different to the other Radiohead albums, because like I said with Kid A, I feel like listening to that album is worshipping at the shrine of music. But this album is an album that I feel like I've been in a constant love affair with the moment I heard it. I feel like the moment it came through my speakers for the first time, it just swept me off my feet, where each day with it just gets better and better and better. And I think that analogy is pretty apt in Rainbows. To me, in Rainbows, it's an album about love, and I don't think you have any other Radiohead album really where such a specific topic is covered in such detail. I mean, even with an OK Computer, for example, which is a quote-unquote a concept album, you know, I feel like on that album there are still other points of discussion, like government corruption. This is an album for me that's front to back about different types of love and how human beings handle them in their day-to-day lives. And to that end, I think it has probably the best lyrics in Tom's entire discography. I'll go through that as I go through this track list, but I honestly think Tom, as a lyrics writer, has never bettered himself here. He has some of the most potent expressions of love and loss and joy and heartbreak on this album that you'll ever hear from a songwriter, ever. Likewise too, I think that Nigel Godrich's production has never been better on this album. In fact, I think a lot of things have never been better on this album. I mean, going back to the production just quickly, he experimented with that binaural production on this album, which is honestly an incredible feature. I'm surprised they haven't used it on more Radiohead albums. I believe they used it on A Moon-Shaped Pool, but it isn't as punchy sounding as this. It truly does feel like when you listen to this album, the band is playing directly in front of you, and all of the instruments are recorded with the most delightful bite and punch and sort of sparkly sound to them that I don't think any other Radiohead album matches. But more than that, this is one of very, very few albums. Like, I don't think there are many albums out there. I think there's possibly this and another album, which I might cover in another Worst to Best, that I truly consider, from front to back across the track list, perfect. Like, I literally don't think on this entire track list there is one song that I would replace. There is one song that I consider worse than the others, and there is not a single song that lets down the aesthetic promise that this album is going for. I think it's by far Radiohead's most consistent albums, and genuinely one of the most consistent albums of all time, where the only reason I prefer some songs is because they're just simply better than the others. But there is no song, in my opinion, that is worse than the others. I think it's Radiohead's most consistent album. I think it's one of the most consistent albums ever written. And it does a weird thing for an album to do where I think none of the tracks are weaker than the others. There are just some that I prefer more. So the album opens with 15 Step, which is this gorgeous, skittery, glitchy, electronically treated song, but with this lovely organic edge in the form of those punchy, sharp acoustic drums and Johnny's incredibly smooth and calming guitar line in 5/4. I think this song is just a total ton of fun. It is so fun. And whenever I listen to it, I always get compelled, almost more than any other Radiohead song, just to get up and dance. And there are few songs that do that for me, honestly. Then it just flips the coin altogether and goes to Body Snatchers, which is perhaps one of Radiohead's heaviest songs. I think in fact, I'd actually make a claim that it's Radiohead's heaviest song. A lot of people disagree with me, but it's all in that central fiery guitar riff that has, you know, echoes of Wolfmother and Led Zeppelin. It's just an incredibly inspired guitar part, and it just sounds, the way Nigel Godrich produces it, it sounds huge, massive, absolutely larger than life. It has this real bite and aggression to it that isn't present in the same way on this otherwise quite dreamy and light album. I think it's an absolutely flaying, caterwauling mess of a song, and I love it for that exact reason. Then once again the coin flips, and we're back to a calmer moment with Nude, one of Radiohead's most meditative songs. Colin's bass line that pretty much reinvented this age-old song into a totally new, almost dub-inspired thing is absolutely classic. One of his best bass lines with the, you know, bum, bing, bing, bing sort of thing it has going on is just fantastic. And Tom's falsetto vocals, the way they're just placed in the center of the channel, just like mind-blowingly beautiful production. Oh my god, the wins on this album just keep coming. I mean, next you have Weird Fishes, which used to be my least favourite track on the album and now no longer is. I think it's an absolutely stunning track, full of those polyrhythmic snaking guitar lines and Colin's incredible bass work, especially towards the end with this lovely velvety, slightly melancholic tone to it. The way it just all comes together and folds and meshes together to make one of Radiohead's most sublime and trancy songs. It's just brilliant and really a testament to how incredible they are as songwriters. I've said that a lot on this Worst to Best, and I'm never going to stop saying it. And then you have All I Need, which I think is the most beautiful Radiohead song ever written. People, for some reason, say that this is a depressing song. I don't read it as a depressing song at all. I think All I Need is a song about love. It's a song about flawed love, but it's still a song about love, and I think there's this incredible hope to it. This incredible hope that comes out in that final, climactic section, which feels like the heavens opening up and just raining down on you. I think the bass line on the song is, again, fantastic. Like, Colin kills it on this album. I love how the glockenspiel is played to add a little bit of levity to the mixing and to break it up a little bit. I think the lyrics are fantastic. The melody is incredible. Never fails to make me melancholy, and it's such a bittersweet and just mind-blowingly incredible song. And then, holy fucking shit, then you have Falstaff, which is one of Radiohead's softest songs, and just incredible again. Like, I'm sick of saying that word, but it's just absolutely immense and incredible with that incredible string work towards the end and those dueling guitars, the acoustics between Tom and Johnny, while Tom sings this really domestic song about the sort of monotony of day-to-day life, but finding beauty in it. And I think it's honestly such a soothing and gorgeous song that's just opened itself over time for me. And the people that call that song filler, honestly, I will never understand them, ever. Likewise too, you have Reckoner, which, although it's my least favourite track on the album, that still means like it's a strong maybe 8 out of 10 for me. I think it's gorgeous. I love the percussion work. I love the guitar work. I love Tom's crooning falsetto and how it transitions from that sort of quite grooving first third to the really sparse and string-heavy middle third, and to that coda that just sends the song out beautifully. I can see why some people call that their favourite Radiohead song, and honestly, I would respect you if you had that as your opinion. Then you have the dub-influenced groove of House of Cards, which might seem plain and sparse on the outside, but listen to it enough and it just really opens itself up to you. I think the lyrics on that song are some of my favourite Tom lyrics ever. I love the domesticity of them. I love how grounded they are in everyday life. I love how they talk about an affair, ostensibly, which sort of fits into the whole love thing that I think this album is going for. And then you get on to a little song called Jigsaw Falling Into Place. I don't know, it's tough. This used to be my favourite song of all time. Jigsaw Falling Into Place, for the longest time, used to be my favourite song ever. And now I think one song might have overtaken it, but this used to be my favourite song of all time, and it's my favourite Radiohead song they've ever done. Every single note, every single moment, every single lyric, every single bass flourish by Colin or guitar line from Johnny or Ed is just perfect. This song is probably the most perfect song ever written in my mind. It's a song that I can re-listen to over and over and over again and never get sick of once. And it's a song that I'm just so passionate about. I think from front to back, it is genuinely, and I mean this without exaggeration, probably the best song ever written. Not my favourite by one spot, but the best. And then this album closes out with Videotape. Such a sad way to end the album, man. Such a sad and melancholic way to end the album. Some of Tom's saddest lyrics about like saying goodbye to everyone you love and having your life just committed to videotape so that your family members can still have memories of you. It's indescribably beautiful. I've been saying that about pretty much every track on this album, but it is indescribably gorgeous. And honestly, I'll never get the people that say that the live version from 2006 is better than the studio version, because what this song needs, in my opinion, is that delicate arrangement with the light electronic flourishes. I think it's been done absolutely perfectly, and I wouldn't have had a closer any other way than what Videotape does for In Rainbows. Overall, In Rainbows probably still stands to be, if not my favourite album of all time, then certainly in top 3. I think it is Radiohead's magnum opus. It is the band at the absolute apex, the pinnacle of their powers. And I will continue my love affair with this album pretty much, I think, throughout my entire life. And with that, I'm done with the Radiohead Worst to Best. So thank you so much for watching. I had an absolute blast recording this and writing for it. If you have any opinions on my opinions, let me know. I'd love to hear them and respond to them. Subscribe. I'll be doing more of these Worst to Best in the future, so let me know what artists you'd like me to do a ranking for. I love watching other Worst to Best videos and reading Worst to Best articles, so this is really fun for me to do. So yeah, hit the like button, subscribe, do all that good stuff, and I will see you in the next video, which will probably be another reaction to a new album. But we'll see, you never know. So, thank you so much for watching. I love you guys. Goodbye.